Power rarely collapses at the moment it makes its first mistake. It collapses much later, after it has repeated the same mistake so many times that it no longer recognizes it as one. Blindness in power does not arrive suddenly. It is not announced. It does not feel like ignorance. In fact, the most dangerous form of blindness feels exactly like certainty. At the beginning, power sees clearly. It emerges from struggle, competition, chaos, or collapse. Its survival depends on attention, learning, feedback, and adaptation. Every decision matters. Every signal is valuable. Every mistake is costly. In this early phase, power listens. It listens because it has to. Because reality has not yet been subdued. Because consequences are immediate. Because failure is visible. But as power stabilizes, something subtle begins to change. Success creates repetition. Repetition creates routine. Routine creates predictability. And predictability slowly reduces the perceived need to listen. Nothing dramatic happens at first. There is no single moment where power decides to stop paying attention. Instead, attention becomes selective. Signals that confirm existing beliefs are amplified. Signals that challenge them are delayed, softened, or reinterpreted. Reality does not disappear. It becomes filtered. This is the first stage of blindness. Not the absence of information, but the narrowing of perception. Power still believes it understands the system. In fact, it believes it understands the system better than anyone else. And in one sense, it is right. Power has experience. It has memory. It has historical reference. It has data. It has models, but experience can harden into assumption. Memory can become nostalgia. Models can replace observation. And slowly, without noticing, power stops asking the questions that once kept it alive. Early on, power asks, what is happening? Why is this working? What are we missing? What could go wrong? Later, power asks different questions. How do we maintain this? How do we preserve stability? How do we prevent disruption? How do we control outcomes? These questions feel responsible. They feel rational. They feel mature, but they signal a shift. Power is no longer oriented toward understanding reality. It is oriented toward protecting its position within reality. And this is where blindness begins to deepen. Because reality does not stop changing simply because power has stopped questioning it. Complex systems evolve continuously. Economic conditions shift. Technologies alter behavior. Cultural values drift. Incentives change. Constraints move. But power, once stabilized, increasingly relies on internal representations of reality rather than direct engagement with it. Reports replace observation. Metrics replace context. Summaries replace nuance. Abstractions replace lived experience. None of this feels dangerous from the inside. In fact, it feels efficient. Why listen to raw signals when you have systems that filter them? Why engage with complexity when models simplify it? Why tolerate ambiguity when frameworks provide clarity? And yet, every layer added between power and reality increases moral and cognitive distance. Feedback becomes slower. Distortion increases. Uncomfortable truths arrive diluted, delayed, or framed as anomalies. Over time, power begins to confuse order with understanding. As long as things appear stable, power assumes it sees clearly. As long as disruptions are contained, power assumes its perspective is accurate. This assumption is rarely questioned, because questioning it would require admitting that stability might be misleading, and stability is seductive. Stability creates the illusion that nothing urgent is happening. It makes slow decline feel like background noise. It makes small failures feel manageable. It makes warning signs feel exaggerated. Power does not become blind because it is malicious. It becomes blind because blindness is comfortable. Seeing clearly requires friction. It requires exposure to dissent. It requires accepting uncertainty. It requires acknowledging limits. Blindness removes all of that. Blindness allows power to operate smoothly, to make decisions without moral hesitation, to prioritize continuity over correction, to treat anomalies as noise rather than signals. And because nothing collapses immediately, blindness is reinforced. Each day without disaster feels like proof. Each avoided crisis feels like validation. Each maintained structure feels like success. This reinforcement is powerful. It teaches power that its current way of seeing is sufficient, that deeper questioning is unnecessary, that alternative perspectives are disruptive rather than informative. At this stage, power often becomes hostile to ambiguity. Ambiguity threatens certainty. Certainty underpins authority. Authority depends on appearing in control. So complexity is simplified. Nuance is flattened. Uncertainty is reframed as incompetence or disloyalty. Those who raise uncomfortable questions are no longer seen as contributors. They are seen as risks. This is another critical moment in the development of blindness. Power begins to associate challenge with threat, not openly, not consciously, but structurally. Processes evolve to minimize friction. Language becomes cautious. Feedback is sanitized. Criticism is delayed, softened, or redirected. No one explicitly says, "Do not tell us the truth." But everyone learns which truths are welcome and which are costly. And slowly, reality becomes quieter, not because it has stabilized, but because fewer people are willing to describe it honestly. From the inside, power interprets this silence as confirmation. No one is objecting. No one is warning us. No one is sounding the alarm. But silence is not absence of danger. It is often the presence of fear, resignation, or exhaustion. By the time power realizes it is no longer receiving meaningful feedback, it is usually too late to restore it easily, because the systems that once transmitted reality have been reshaped to protect authority instead. This is how blindness becomes structural. Not a failure of individuals, not a lack of intelligence, but a property of the system itself. At this point, power still believes it sees clearly. It believes it understands the environment. It believes it anticipates risks. It believes it is acting responsibly. And this belief is sincere, which makes it far more dangerous than deliberate ignorance, because blindness that knows it is blind can correct itself. Blindness that believes it sees perfectly cannot, and so power continues forward, guided by an increasingly abstract map of a reality that no longer matches the terrain beneath it, unaware that the most important signals have already stopped reaching it, and that the real consequences of this blindness have only just begun to form. At first, these consequences are subtle. They do not arrive as shocks. They do not trigger immediate crisis. They appear as small mismatches between expectation and outcome. A policy produces the intended result, but only partially. A reform works, but slower than predicted. A decision stabilizes one area, while quietly destabilizing another. Power notices these discrepancies, but does not interpret them as warnings. Instead, they are explained away. The model was mostly right. The execution could be improved. External conditions interfered. The timeline needs adjustment. Each explanation is plausible. Each explanation is reasonable. Each explanation preserves the belief that the system is fundamentally understood. This is how blindness protects itself. Rather than rejecting reality, power reinterprets it. Reality is bent just enough to fit existing assumptions. Over time, this reinterpretation becomes habitual. Unexpected outcomes are no longer invitations to rethink the framework. They are treated as deviations within the framework, and so the framework itself remains untouched. This is critical. Because the longer a framework goes unchallenged, the more invisible it becomes. Eventually, power stops seeing it as one perspective among many. It becomes how things are. At this stage, power's blindness is no longer about missing information. It is about misplaced confidence. Power believes it understands not just what is happening, but why it is happening, and what will happen next. This belief creates a dangerous asymmetry. Reality remains complex, adaptive, and nonlinear. Power's understanding becomes increasingly linear, simplified, and closed. The gap between the two widens quietly. Inside power structures, this gap is rarely discussed openly. Why would it be? Acknowledging it would require admitting uncertainty. Uncertainty weakens authority. Authority depends on confidence. So, confidence becomes performative. Decisions are framed decisively. Language becomes assertive. Doubt is expressed only privately, if at all. And the system begins to reward those who appear certain, not those who are correct, not those who are curious, but those who sound confident. This selection pressure matters, because over time, power fills itself with people who are good at maintaining narratives, not challenging them. People who understand how to align with expectations. People who know how to speak the language of stability. People who can translate complex reality into acceptable summaries. Meanwhile, those who insist on describing reality as it is, messy, ambiguous, uncomfortable, find themselves increasingly isolated, not necessarily punished. Just ignored. Their reports take longer to circulate. Their concerns are postponed. Their warnings are reframed as pessimism. Eventually, many of them stop speaking up, not because they are wrong, but because the system has made it clear that their accuracy is not valued. This is another deepening of blindness. Power no longer loses sight because it cannot see. It loses sight because it has trained itself not to look. And yet, from the inside, everything still feels functional. Meetings continue. Reports are generated. Metrics are tracked. Targets are hit. The machinery of power is intact, which makes the blindness harder to detect. Because collapse is not a prerequisite for dysfunction. Systems can operate efficiently while moving in the wrong direction. They can optimize processes that no longer serve reality. They can perfect control mechanisms that suppress adaptation. They can maintain order while losing relevance. This is why power often equates smooth operation with correct understanding. If nothing is breaking, power assumes nothing is wrong. But this assumption misunderstands how complex failure works. In complex systems, failure is rarely explosive at first. It is accumulative. Small errors compound. Delayed feedback amplifies distortion. Local optimizations create systemic fragility, and blindness accelerates all of it, because blind power does not correct early. It corrects late, and often harshly. When reality finally pushes back strongly enough to be felt, power is surprised, not because the warning signs were absent, but because they were dismissed. The surprise itself is revealing. It exposes how disconnected power has become from the environment it governs. How could this happen? Why didn't we see this coming? Who failed to inform us? These questions are asked sincerely, but they miss the point. The issue is not that information was unavailable. It is that the system no longer knew how to recognize information as meaningful. By the time power feels forced to confront reality, its options are already constrained. Adaptation becomes expensive. Correction becomes destabilizing. Reform becomes threatening. And so power often responds not with openness, but with more control. Control feels like clarity. Control feels like action. Control feels like regaining sight. But control is not perception. In fact, excessive control often worsens blindness. It reduces variation. It suppresses signals. It punishes deviation, which further disconnects power from reality. At this point, blindness begins to shape not just decisions, but ethics. When power cannot see consequences clearly, moral distance increases. Decisions are justified abstractly. Harm is reframed as necessary. Responsibility is distributed until it disappears. No one feels fully accountable because no one feels fully informed. And this moral diffusion reinforces blindness because acknowledging harm would require confronting how little was understood. So harm is normalized. Costs are externalized. Failures are attributed to complexity rather than misjudgment. Power tells itself, this was unavoidable. This is the cost of stability. This is how systems work. These statements are not lies. They are defenses. They protect the belief that power still sees clearly, even as evidence accumulates that it does not. And still, from the inside, collapse feels distant. The system is large. It has buffers. It has momentum. It has precedent. Blindness does not feel urgent when decline is gradual, which is why power rarely panics early. Instead, it becomes rigid. Rigid systems feel strong. They resist change. They enforce consistency. They suppress volatility. But rigidity is not resilience. It is often the opposite, because resilience requires responsiveness, and responsiveness requires perception. Blind power lacks both. It continues forward, guided by outdated assumptions, confident narratives, and filtered feedback, unaware that the world it believes it understands has already moved beyond the boundaries of its vision. Unaware that the world it believes it understands has already moved beyond the boundaries of its vision. At this stage, power is no longer simply blind. It is operating on an outdated reality. The assumptions that once produced success are still being applied, but the conditions that made them valid no longer exist. Yet because change has been gradual, the mismatch does not feel dramatic. Power interprets unfamiliar outcomes as temporary distortions rather than structural shifts. This is a critical psychological moment. Instead of updating its understanding, power begins to defend it. New information is not integrated. It is evaluated for compatibility. If it fits the existing framework, it is accepted. If it challenges it, it is questioned, delayed, or dismissed. This creates a false sense of rational scrutiny. From the inside, it feels like careful analysis. From the outside, it looks like denial. But denial is rarely conscious. Power does not say, we refuse to see. It says, we need more data. We need to be cautious. We cannot overreact. Caution becomes an excuse for inaction. Inaction becomes a pattern. And the gap between perception and reality widens further. As blindness deepens. Power increasingly relies on historical legitimacy. Past success becomes evidence of present competence. Longevity is treated as proof of understanding. Survival is mistaken for wisdom. This reliance on history is comforting. It provides continuity. It stabilizes identity. It reassures those within the system that they are part of something enduring. But history is a poor substitute for perception. The fact that something worked before does not mean it still works now. The fact that a system survived previous challenges does not guarantee it understands the current ones. Yet power clings to precedent. Precedent reduces uncertainty. It limits the need for imagination. It narrows the range of acceptable responses. And imagination is dangerous to blind power. Imagination introduces alternatives. Alternatives imply choice. Choice implies responsibility. Blind power prefers inevitability, that it frames outcomes as unavoidable. It frames constraints as natural. It frames decline as external. This framing protects authority. If outcomes are inevitable, no one is at fault. If decline is external, the system remains innocent. If responsibility is diffuse, accountability disappears. This is how blindness becomes morally insulated. Power no longer feels compelled to ask whether it could act differently. It only asks how to manage consequences. Management replaces judgment. Procedure replaces ethics. Compliance replaces reflection. Decisions are evaluated based on consistency with policy, not alignment with reality. And because policies were designed for a world that no longer exists, they increasingly fail to produce desired outcomes. But instead of questioning the policy, power increases enforcement. More rules, more oversight, more reporting, more control. Each layer of control further distances power from the ground. Those closest to reality, frontline workers, local actors, affected populations, are now filtered through multiple bureaucratic layers. Their experiences are summarized. Their language is neutralized. Their urgency is diluted. By the time information reaches decision makers, it no longer carries emotional weight. And without emotional weight, moral signals weaken. This is another form of blindness. Power still receives information, but it no longer feels it. Suffering becomes abstract. Costs become numbers. Failures become percentages. This abstraction allows decisions that would feel unacceptable if experienced directly. And because power is shielded from direct consequence, it remains calm. Calmness is mistaken for rationality. Distance is mistaken for objectivity. But objectivity without proximity is often illusion. True understanding requires friction. It requires contact with discomfort. It requires exposure to consequence. Blind power avoids all three. As a result, it becomes increasingly surprised by resistance. When people push back, power interprets it as irrationality, as misinformation, as ingratitude, as destabilization. It does not recognize resistance as feedback, because feedback challenges the assumption that power still sees clearly. Instead, resistance is pathologized. It is attributed to ignorance rather than insight, to emotion rather than experience, to manipulation rather than reality. This misinterpretation deepens the divide. Power responds with containment rather than curiosity, with suppression rather than inquiry. And each act of suppression further confirms power's belief that resistance was the problem all along. This creates a closed loop. Blindness produces misinterpretation. Misinterpretation produces control. Control produces silence. Silence reinforces blindness. At this point, power's internal narrative becomes dominant. It believes it is acting responsibly in a difficult environment. It believes challenges are external, irrational, or malicious. It believes it is protecting stability. And in doing so, it loses the ability to distinguish between stability and stagnation. Stability maintains form. Stagnation loses function. But blind power sees only form. As long as institutions exist, authority persists and procedures are followed. Power assumes the system is alive. It does not notice that adaptability has declined, that trust has eroded, that legitimacy has thinned. These losses are not immediately visible. They do not break infrastructure. They do not halt processes. They do not trigger alarms. They manifest as disengagement, as quiet withdrawal, as passive compliance, which power often misreads as success, because compliance looks orderly. Silence looks peaceful. Predictability looks safe. But beneath this surface, the system is becoming brittle. Brittle systems do not bend. They crack, and blind power rarely anticipates where or when that crack will appear, because anticipating it would require admitting that its vision is incomplete, that its certainty is unjustified, and that the world has changed in ways it no longer understands. That its certainty is unjustified, and that the world has changed in ways it no longer understands. When power reaches this stage, blindness is no longer accidental. It is self-reinforcing. Every structure now exists to protect the way of seeing. That is no longer accurate. Correction becomes dangerous. Not because it is wrong, but because it threatens coherence. Power values coherence deeply. Coherence makes decisions defensible. It aligns actions with narratives. It allows authority to appear consistent over time. But coherence is not the same as truth. Truth evolves. Reality shifts. Conditions change. Coherence resists all three. So blind power begins to prioritize internal consistency over external accuracy. Policies must align with past policies. Statements must align with previous statements. Actions must align with declared principles, even when those principles no longer describe reality. This creates a paradox. The more power tries to remain consistent, the more disconnected it becomes, because consistency locks it into outdated assumptions. Any deviation now feels like weakness. Any admission of error feels destabilizing. Any change in direction feels like loss of control. So power doubles down. It explains failure as miscommunication. It reframes setbacks as transitional costs. It labels systemic problems as isolated incidents. Each explanation reduces pressure to change, and pressure is the only thing that forces blind systems to see again. Without pressure, blindness persists. Inside the system, this persistence feels rational. There are meetings. There are reviews. There are assessments. But these processes are designed to operate within the existing framework, not to challenge it. They ask, did we follow procedure? Did we meet targets? Did we comply with guidelines? They rarely ask, is this framework still valid? Are we solving the right problem? Is reality still aligned with our assumptions? These questions are destabilizing. They threaten careers. They threaten legitimacy. They threaten identity. So they are avoided, not explicitly, but structurally. Blindness becomes embedded in incentives. Those who maintain the narrative advance. Those who disrupt it stall. Those who challenge it exit. Over time, the system selects for loyalty to interpretation rather than accuracy. This is when blindness becomes institutional. No single individual controls it. No single decision creates it. It is the product of alignment between incentives, language, process, and power. At this stage, even sincere reformers struggle. They operate inside a system that translates critique into threat. They must speak carefully. They must compromise. They must frame change as continuity, which limits how much change is possible, and so reform becomes cosmetic. New labels are applied to old practices. New slogans accompany unchanged structures. New goals are announced without new mechanisms. From the outside, it looks like motion. From the inside, it feels like effort, but reality remains untouched. Blindness deepens. Meanwhile, external conditions continue to evolve. Pressures increase. Margins shrink. Tolerance declines. But power interprets these changes through its existing lens. It assumes resistance is temporary. It assumes disruption will stabilize. It assumes control will restore order. These assumptions are not unreasonable. They worked before. That is what makes them dangerous. Because power mistakes historical success for current relevance. And relevance decays quietly. By the time power begins to feel strain, it is already constrained. Options that once existed are gone. Trust that once buffered mistakes has eroded. Flexibility that once allowed adaptation has been traded for rigidity. At this point, power often shifts tone. Confidence becomes defensive. Certainty becomes brittle. Authority becomes sensitive to challenge. Small critiques provoke strong reactions. Minor disruptions trigger heavy responses. Not because power is strong, but because it is insecure. Insecurity is a late-stage symptom of blindness. It signals that power senses instability, but cannot locate its source. Unable to diagnose the real problem, it targets visible ones: protest, dissent, deviation. These are easier to confront than abstract misalignment, and confronting them provides the illusion of action. Action feels like vision. Movement feels like control, but control is not sight. In fact, excessive control often signals the absence of sight. It compensates for uncertainty by narrowing behavior. It reduces risk by eliminating variation. It restores order by suppressing difference. But difference is where information lives. Variation carries signals. Deviation reveals stress points. Anomalies expose blind spots. By suppressing them, power blinds itself further. And still, collapse does not come immediately. That is what makes this phase deceptive. The system limps forward. It absorbs shocks. It survives crisis. Each survival reinforces the belief that blindness is manageable, but survivability is not sustainability. The system is no longer learning. It is no longer adapting. It is no longer renewing. It is consuming its reserves. Trust, legitimacy, flexibility, meaning. These reserves are invisible until they are depleted. And blind power rarely tracks what it cannot quantify. By the time depletion becomes visible, recovery is difficult, because restoring sight requires humility. And humility threatens authority. Admitting blindness means admitting limits. Admitting limits means sharing power. Sharing power means risking loss. So power hesitates. It waits. It delays. It hopes stability will return. But stability is no longer available, because stability was a product of alignment, and alignment was lost long ago. All that remains is control without understanding. Order without insight, authority without vision. And this is the moment where blindness is no longer just a weakness. It becomes the condition that determines how power will ultimately end. And this is the moment where blindness is no longer just a weakness. It becomes the condition that determines how power will ultimately end. Because when power loses vision, it does not stop acting. It acts more, but it acts without orientation. Decisions continue to be made. Policies continue to be enforced. Structures continue to function. From the outside, it can look like strength. From the inside, it feels like necessity. Power tells itself there is no alternative. That conditions are harsh. That control must be maintained. And in doing so, it locks itself into a narrow range of responses. Blind power does not explore. It repeats. It repeats familiar strategies, because unfamiliar ones feel risky. It repeats old solutions, because new ones require admitting ignorance. It repeats control, because understanding would require listening, and listening is dangerous. Listening introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty undermines authority. Authority depends on appearing sure. So power chooses certainty over accuracy. This choice is subtle but decisive. Once certainty becomes more important than truth, blindness becomes irreversible without rupture, because truth requires revision. Revision requires humility. Humility requires vulnerability. Blind power cannot afford vulnerability. Its legitimacy is already thin. Its margins are already narrow. Its room for error is already reduced. So it continues forward, confident, rigid, and increasingly detached. At this stage, collapse is often misunderstood. It is imagined as a dramatic event, a sudden breakdown, a visible failure. But collapse is rarely sudden. It is the point at which blind power can no longer compensate for its lack of vision. Control reaches its limit. Suppression stops working. Narratives lose credibility. Reality, long ignored, asserts itself. And when it does, power is shocked, not because reality changed suddenly, but because power stopped tracking it long ago. The shock feels external, unfair, unexpected. How could this happen so fast? But it was not fast, it was slow, incremental, normalized. Every ignored signal, every dismissed warning, every silenced dissent, each one narrowed vision, just a little more, until power was operating almost entirely on memory rather than perception. At the end, blindness expresses itself as confusion. Decisions feel ineffective. Responses feel delayed. Actions feel disconnected from outcomes. Power becomes reactive. And reaction is the opposite of control. In reaction, power loses coherence. It contradicts itself. It improvises without understanding. The certainty that once defined authority fractures. Those within the system feel it. First, confusion replaces confidence. Fear replaces justification. Urgency replaces deliberation. This is when power begins to notice something is wrong. But by then, what it notices is not blindness. It notices instability. And it treats instability as the problem. So it applies more control, more enforcement, more restriction, more rigidity. But control cannot restore sight. In fact, it accelerates collapse. Because collapse is not caused by lack of power. It is caused by lack of perception. Power that can see can adapt. Power that cannot see can only impose, and imposition has limits. Eventually, the system encounters realities it cannot suppress: economic constraints, social fatigue, cultural drift, technological shifts. These realities do not negotiate with authority. They do not respond to narratives. They require understanding. And blind power no longer has a. At this point, outcomes are no longer shaped by intention. They are shaped by inertia. Momentum carries the system forward, but direction is lost. What follows may look like chaos, but it is not random. It is the delayed consequence of long-term blindness. Every system that collapses reaches this point, not when it is weak, not when it is attacked, but when it can no longer see itself clearly. Because power rarely notices when it becomes blind. It notices when blindness has already shaped every decision. It notices when options are gone, when trust is exhausted, when adaptation is impossible. By the time power seeks clarity, clarity requires surrender, and surrender is something blind power is least prepared to do. This is the final irony. Power loses sight, not because it lacks intelligence, but because it believes intelligence has already done its work, because it mistakes certainty for understanding, control for perception, stability for alignment. And in doing so, it ensures that when reality finally demands attention, power will be the last to understand what is happening to it, and the least capable of responding when it does.